Let's do it.
Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome back to the Alyosha Society, where we're pursuing truth and beauty and goodness through great literature. All right, friends, this is video number 3. You have watched, hopefully, if you haven't done it, you need to turn this off right now and go back and watch video number 1 and 2, the introductions I did on the causes that led up to the American Civil War. Now, I told you at the end of that video that I had a special treat for you, and here he is. His name is Dr. John Wilsey, and I'm just gonna have to make a confession right here before I even introduce him. Friends, all of the content that I shared with you in the previous video, actually, most of it really came from my good friend, Dr. John Wilsey, because he's an expert on this time period. He's an expert on a lot of things, but he knows more about American history and specifically this time period than anybody I know. So let's see here. How do we do this? 30 plus year friendship. John, I was just thinking earlier, I believe that you are my longest running friend. Like, I have, friends from college, but I don't really keep up with them anymore.
Yeah.
And you and I were wreaking havoc on the world before either of us got married.
That's true. That's true. I think you're my longest running friend too.
We're still here.
You're the person I've kept up with for the longest. And that would be, let's see, today is the 20th, right?
Yeah.
So we would have met. We met in about a week. In about a week, it would be our anniversary of having met. 1992.
Yeah, and what's funny is I know we talked about a lot of things, but it did not take me long to figure out that you were passionate about this topic. I mean, I knew it.
I know. I remember why.
we had some fun discussions. I remember thinking, dang, this guy's a college graduate. I mean, he's not a PhD yet. And I didn't know anybody that knew the intricacies of this whole thing. But let me give you a little bit better of a formal introduction. Students, Dr. Wilsey, apart from being my best friend, he graduated from Furman University in 1992 with a degree in history. He then we taught together back in the early 1990s. Now, for those of you who don't know, that's the 20th century. That's towards the end of the 20th century when we taught together. We
back
both
went, 90s.
It is, yeah. And we both ended up going to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. John Wilsey graduated from that seminary with a Master of Divinity. He then went on to finish out his PhD, his Praise Him Daily, as I like to call it. Well, no, he actually has a real PhD from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he has taught at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he currently teaches at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, I mean, I know I missed a lot, but I just wanted to get your street cred out there.
Thanks, man.
Your credentials. But the coolest thing about Dr. Wilsey is that he's my friend.
That's the best part. That's the best part.
So, Johnny, you ready to talk about some American Civil War?
Always, man.
Okay, let me, I'm going to pop up a visual for my students here. And then we're going to put the visual down and just talk a little bit. So students, you should have already taken a screenshot of this. This is the big picture. So we've already done 2 introductory videos on Killer Angels. Today, we're going to be looking at Monday, June the 29th in this video. And if you look at the videos throughout, you'll see this is the way that Michael Shara has divided the book up, not really so much by chapters, although it does have chapter numbers. It's by the 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg. So there it is. And Dr. Wilsey, I'd like to welcome you formally, and I'd like to ask you, did I miss anything in the introduction? And exactly how cool is it for you to be speaking to my students?
It is the coolest thing. And I have to say to your students, I've said this many, many times before, and I mean it. I tell people this very frequently.
Ooh.
That Bruce Eder is the most effective and the finest classroom teacher I've ever seen. And that's 20 years of secondary school teaching and administration and 12, 13 years of seminary classroom teaching.
That's the only, if I had to rebuild my resume to get another job right now, I'd take everything else off and just put that.
You should.
That's all what else do I need?
You're the best classroom teacher I've ever seen.
That is, I honestly, thank you, John. I appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you, someone who's been there. And I should have mentioned this too. Dr. Wilsey has not only taught high school students, he's worked in administration. He's been a youth pastor. He's into orienteering, and he's a big hiker. I'm just going to say this, he's in much better shape than I am. And God love him. God love him.
My entire heart is working and pumping without any technological aids.
Right. Right. I'm on a lot of meds, but
yeah, I know. That's why you're the best classroom teacher. It takes a lot of meds to keep you going.
That's right. Line me up and let me go.
That's it.
Well, the first thing I'm guessing, John, is when students saw this on their list and they're not familiar with it, they're probably thinking, what is up with the title?
Yeah.
Killer Angels. Talk to us a little bit about what in the world that's all about.
Well, there's a great deal of transcendentalism that's represented in that title. Chamberlain, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is of course one of the main characters in Michael Shara's book, and for good reason. He's one of the main central figures in the Battle of Gettysburg. And there's a scene in the book and there's a scene in the movie in which Joshua Lawrence Colonel Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Regiment is talking to his friend who's a sergeant, Sergeant Kilrain, and they're discussing, they talk about slavery and they talk about this, that, and the third thing. They're reflecting on the war, and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was a rhetoric professor at Bowdoin College before the war, he quotes a line from Hamlet about man being an angel, about the nature of man and the glory of man, and how wonderful man is. And he quotes Hamlet, calls man an angel, and Kilrain says, well, something along the lines, if he's an angel, then he's a killer angel.
Oh yeah.
Now, so the transcendentalism part is evident in that statement. And also transcendentalism, as you probably know, and your students probably know, that transcendentalism was big in the 19th century, mid-19th century, thanks to Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists. The idea that human nature is good and noble. So along with Hamlet, the quote from Hamlet, there's a great deal of sort of romanticism, transcendentalism sort of built into that title.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think, we have actually, let's see, students who are watching this right now, they could just be watching it because they wanted to read this one book. They could be watching it because they're taking a course that I have called Great Books 3. And in that course, we do discuss Emerson and Whitman. So students, if you're a part of that, then I think Dr. Wilsey's comment is going to help a lot more. So this next question, I'm honestly, I'm not sure if I've ever asked you this, and it's really more for selfish reasons. I'm kind of dying to know the answer. You and I have probably discussed, just over coffee or pizza or whatever, just about every time period in history. You know that I have a passion for ancient history. I also enjoy modern literature. So we've gone the gamut. But I never developed quite the intense passion that you have for not only this time period, but specifically the American Civil War. And if you want to even zero down to the Battle of Gettysburg, what is it? And I want you to, tell my students why they should want to dig into it more.
Well, there are a lot of personal reasons. When I was a child growing up, my grandfather was my greatest influence. And my grandfather was loved history. He loved the Greeks. He loved the Romans. He loved ancient history. And my grandfather was also, he was born in 1913, and his grandfather was an officer under Stonewall Jackson in the Civil War. So he sat at his grandfather's, feet, listening to stories about the war.
Wow.
And I sat at his feet, listening to him talk about the war through his grandfather's eyes. So I became interested in the Civil War as a child because of my grandfather, because of the personal connection, the personal link to the past, and also because his love for history was a very contagious thing. And then also there's a part of me, I'm from Georgia, and William Faulkner in his novel, I believe it's In Terror and Decorum. No, that's by Peter Vurik. Sorry. I'm getting my authors and poets mixed up.
Sorry.
But somewhere William Faulkner wrote that for every Southern boy, it's always about 2:00 in the afternoon on a July day on a ridge in Pennsylvania. And what he meant by
what he's talking about.
Yeah, it's always just before Pickett's charge.
Okay.
And for every Southern boy growing up, the idea there is that it's always maybe this time, maybe this time. And that I remember hearing my grandfather talk about William Faulkner, and only recently read that essay or that line. It's in a novel of his, and I'm blanking on what novel it is now, but that was something that was very penetrating for me when I was a young child and an early teenager. So I got interested in the Civil War, and I got interested in Gettysburg from a very early age.
That to me, the students are probably looking at this and thinking, my goodness, this happened 150 years ago. This has nothing to do with my life today. But you have about as direct of a line connecting you to the American Civil War that you could possibly have. And I think, what I'm hearing you say is that it's way more real for you, and it's way closer. And I think that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
There's another part of that I didn't mention. That's on my grandfather's side, and then on my grandmother's side, her grandfather was a brigadier general under Longstreet. And he was killed at Fredericksburg in December of 1862, but his brigade fought under Wofford, and they took the Peach Orchard on the second day. So my great-great-great-grandfather wasn't present for Gettysburg, but his brigade under Wofford took the Peach Orchard and held it. So that's also another familial connection.
That is absolutely awesome. And by the way, another little connection I'll throw in for our students. Fredericksburg's kind of a special place for us because that's basically the area of the country that John and I were hanging out and doing stuff for a long time.
Yeah, but way out in the country, man. We were out there in the rural areas.
Yeah, we were. We're a little south. Well, here we go. So let's set the stage before we kind of build up. And obviously in this video, we're looking at Monday. We're looking at Monday, which would have been June the 29th. But just that, the way I like to teach, and I think it's probably the way you like to teach, because I think we both think it's best, is to start big and broad, 30,000 feet, and then we're going to bring it down to the very dirt on the battlefield. So talk to us a little bit, John, about the whatever you think is appropriate to get the students in the context, days and weeks leading up to the battle. And if you want, you can keep in mind, I have shared the previous video I shared with the students. You probably don't even remember this. A long time ago, you shared with me 5 pressures, 3 mini sparks, and 1 big stick of dynamite that really contributed to, the beginning of the American Civil War. So you can keep that in mind. I've shared all that content with them.
Okay, good. Well, a little, if you've already covered some of this in Killer Angels, you already know the introduction. What the overall strategy was, what Lee's plan was, why did he invade Pennsylvania in the first place? It was actually a very controversial idea. In May, they fought the Battle of Chancellorsville, and it was Lee's greatest military achievement. It was his greatest victory, but he also lost his most talented subordinate, Stonewall Jackson, in that battle. But it was a tremendous success, and at that point, the Confederate government had a choice to make about what to do next. And Lee went down to Richmond and had a council of war, if you will, with President Davis and the Secretary of War, whose name was James Seddon, and 1 or 2 other people that were probably there. Actually, I think the whole cabinet was there. The whole cabinet was present. So Davis and Seddon in particular were in favor of detaching a very large portion of the Army of Northern Virginia from Lee and putting them on trains and sending them down to Mississippi to support John Pemberton, who was defending Vicksburg. And Vicksburg was the last section of the Mississippi River that was not held by the Union, which meant that supplies coming in from Galveston could get across the Mississippi River and over to the Confederate armies in the Western and the Eastern theaters. But Grant was attempting to take Vicksburg in order to cut the Confederacy in half and deprive the Confederacy of the port of Galveston, which was, a very, everybody was afraid of that. Everybody was worried that Grant was going to be able to do that. So what most of the people in the cabinet wanted to do was support Pemberton at Vicksburg and defeat Grant. The Postmaster General was named John Reagan. Interestingly enough, this is the only Postmaster General in the history of the English-speaking world who ever ran the post office so that he turned a profit. The U.S. Post Office has never turned a profit. The Confederate Post Office turned a profit in the first year of his administration. Anyway, John Reagan said, the war is not going to be won and lost in the East. The war is going to be won or lost with Grant. If Grant wins, then we're going to lose. If Grant can be defeated, then the Confederacy will win. He was the only person in that cabinet meeting that voted against Lee's proposal to invade the North. And even after that vote, he continued to say and advocate to Davis, the president, you need to tell Lee not to do this, but nobody would listen to him.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so Lee's strategy was, if you have a victory on Northern soil, then if you defeat the Union Army on Northern soil, then at that point you can threaten Philadelphia, you can threaten Baltimore, you can threaten Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
and the people in the North will demand will demand it into the war on the basis of secession.
Yeah,
and that was probably true. Alan Guelzo, who is one of my favorite Civil War historians, he makes the point, and Shelby Foote makes the same point in his Civil War history in the 2nd volume when he talks about Gettysburg, that if the Confederacy had defeated the Union Army at Gettysburg, then that would have probably been it for the Union Army. They had suffered losses for a full year, one loss after the next, after the next, after the next. And a loss in Pennsylvania would have caused the Union Army probably to completely dissolve. At which point Lee really would have he really would have been holding all the cards.
Yeah.
That was the strategy. That was what he was trying to do. He was trying to get his army up into Pennsylvania. He wanted Ewell's Second Corps to take Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania, and have the Union Army pursue. That they would be able to find a good battleground and destroy the Union Army piece by piece as it came up, weary and footsore from having marched.
Good grief. So I'm glad you said all of that, because it kind of brings home for our students, this is not just a battle. This is really a decisive battle in the development of the war. Okay, so one of the things that I'm going to be talking about with the students is in a work of historical fiction. Obviously, you have both, and the way Michael Shaara has set this up, he says, and I believe he's telling the truth, that he tried to use, letters, correspondence, every piece of primary source information he could, so that even when he was putting words into the mouths of folks, they probably didn't say those exact words, but it would be very consistent with what they would or could have said. So at the very, very beginning of the book, as you know, a spy comes to Longstreet and informs him that he has seen the Union Army nearby. Historically accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. That happened. That was Henry Thomas Harrison. Okay. And he enlisted in the Mississippi State Militia at the beginning of the war as a private. And then he later became a Confederate spy. He got to know Longstreet. He met Longstreet down in Suffolk, Virginia, which is down in the southern part of the state. Longstreet had been detached from the Army of Northern Virginia in late April, early May of 1863. So Longstreet was not there for the Battle of Chancellorsville. He was gathering supplies for the Army of Northern Virginia and Southern Virginia, and Harrison met Longstreet and utilized, he was utilized as a spy for Longstreet down in Southern Virginia. And I believe that there's a line in the book where he says, I paid you in gold. Longstreet did pay him in gold. He paid him in gold, and he paid him in Northern greenbacks, because Confederate scrip was pretty much worthless.
Right.
So he paid him in gold, gold coins that were, minted by the United States Mint, and he paid him in paper money as well.
So, okay, so talk to us a little bit. My students are somewhere in the range of, let's say, 8th, 9th, 10th graders. They have not been to the War College. Most of them probably don't know a whole lot about strategy and logistics. So on their level, talk a little bit about logistically why the intel from this spy is so vital at this point.
Well, it's a long way from the Rappahannock River in Northern Virginia to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Today, we take interstates and we take paved roads. In fact, maybe if your students have ever traveled up Route 15 through Maryland up to where you live, up near Lancaster. Yep. State Route 15. 15 runs up through the town of Emmitsburg, Maryland. That's a route of 4-lane highway with a median on it. It's a major highway today. That's the Emmitsburg Road.
Yeah,
that road is what a portion of Meade's army took on the way up to Gettysburg. So imagine back in those days, many of the same major highways that we use today were in use then. They were just dirt tracks. They weren't obviously paved. Some of them may have been what we might consider like dirt roads, gravel roads, but most of them were not paved. So all of the supplies had to be carried by wagons, and the wagons would have been going behind the army, and the wagons had to be guarded by cavalry. It's a long way. You know, the soldiers are walking the entire way. They would do between 20 and 30 miles a day, sometimes longer.
Mm.
So, for example, when Pickett's division came up when he arrived in Gettysburg on the night of the second day, his men had marched over 20 miles, maybe as many as 30 miles the day before. If you've ever walked 30 miles, you know how trying that is and how hard that is. And many times they would march that far and then deploy and go right into battle. One of the reasons why Hood's division was unable to take the Little Round Top was because they had been marching for 30 miles or so, and by the time they deployed for battle, they had already been marching for that many miles, and they just didn't have it. They were just worn out. They couldn't go.
Dude, that's a marathon.
It's a marathon.
I mean, that is basically, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and they'd be carrying 50 pounds of gear and ammunition and a 10-pound musket and on and on. So it was hard on them.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to think about what those men were able to do. And Union soldiers marched those kind of distances as well. It wasn't just the Confederate Army that did. Anyway, so I'll say one other thing about it, and then I'll let you ask another question. Lee was without his cavalry. So General Jeb Stuart was his cavalry commander. And Stuart had, I think, about 5 brigades under his command. 2 of the brigades he was using to guard passes in the Appalachian Mountains. But he had asked, just before the Gettysburg campaign began, he had asked permission of Lee to ride around General Hooker's army, the Union Army, to do damage, to cause mayhem, and also to get his name in the paper and so forth. And he didn't expect that it would be that much trouble, because he had ridden around the Union Army before in 1862. And Lee gave him conditional permission. But he said, you can do that, but just make sure that you always have the feel of Ewell's Second Corps on your left. So he was supposed to, his ultimate mission was to be between Ewell's Second Corps on their northern march and the Union Army on his left.
Mm.
But what happened to Stuart was, on his ride, the Union Army had gotten underway long before anybody expected him to, in pursuit of Lee. And he was trying to get across the Potomac to make contact with Ewell.
Mm.
But every time he tried to get across the Potomac, he found that the Union Army was guarding the fords and the approaches over the Potomac, and he didn't have the strength to overcome them. So he kept having to find other ways around. Long story short, he had to go around a much farther distance to make contact with Ewell. And by the time he was able to make contact with Ewell, he didn't know where Ewell's army was. So it took a really, really long time, much longer than he thought it would take, to make contact with the Confederate Army. And all that time, he needed, he should have been reporting to Lee about the movements of the Union Army, but he was so far away, and he had the Union Army between himself and Lee, that he couldn't get any messages to Lee. So Lee thought, this whole time that they're advancing through Maryland into Pennsylvania, that the Union Army is still in Virginia, still on the other side of the Potomac. So he's not even worried about it. When Harrison comes and tells him, no, the army's in Frederick, Maryland.
Oh, wow.
They're moving north. I mean, that's just 20 miles away from his position on the 28th, 29th of June.
So that's huge.
That's one day's march.
Yeah.
So
that's
extremely alarming to Lee, because Lee's army is spread out over about 100 miles.
Yeah.
Across from northern Maryland all the way up to near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So he immediately sends out orders to Ewell, who is far up near Harrisburg, to Hill, who was his third corps commander, and to Longstreet, his first corps commander, who was down coming up from Maryland, to concentrate at Cashtown. And Cashtown is about 8 miles or so north of Gettysburg. So with the order to concentrate, the entire Army of Northern Virginia begins to converge, and they converge in the direction of Gettysburg. Gettysburg was not their ultimate goal. Cashtown was, but as you all know, on the 1st of July, Henry Heath, who was a division commander under Hill, wanted to get some shoes in Gettysburg, and he wanted to send his division down there to go get it. And he thought that there were only Pennsylvania militia guarding the town, which could easily be swept away by his veterans. But of course, when he got there, it was an entire division commanded by John Buford of cavalry, regular cavalry, and they possessed Spencer repeating rifles, which could fire 7 rounds a minute, whereas the Southern Army, they were carrying muskets, which could only fire 3 shots in a minute.
Good grief.
Anyway, that's a lot to say, but a lot going on there. The main thing to keep in mind is that Stuart wasn't around, and without Stuart, Lee was blind.
That's helpful. Okay. I think you're doing a great job here setting the stage. And before we close out this video, and I'm going to ask the students, I want you to get your notebooks out, and I want you to take notes specifically on what I'm getting ready to ask Dr. Wilsey. So if you need to pause, then just pause the video. But so what I want to get here, and I don't know, this is probably going to be torture for you, 2 to 3 sentences. So extremely brief. Chamberlain, Buford, and Longstreet, maybe, I mean, obviously you can throw in their rank or whatever position, but maybe just, what they were like as people. Let's see if you can do that. Probably hard.
Chamberlain was a professor.
Yeah.
And so he was professorial. He was also ambitious. Can I just, I know this is going to be more than one sentence, but one of the reasons why we all think about Chamberlain as being like the savior of the Union because of what he did up on Little Round Top is because he was a master at self-promotion for his whole life. He died in the early 20th century. He lived a really long time, and he was really good at making him the star. He was a self-promoter.
Okay. That's
it's not that any of it's wrong, and it's not that Sharp is wrong, and what he said, what he wrote about, and what he based his story on.
Yeah,
it's a big battle. Lots was going on, and everybody says, oh, if the Confederates had taken Little Round Top, they would have won the battle, which is probably true. And then the implication is, well, they didn't. So thanks Chamberlain. Chamberlain is the savior of the Union.
Yeah.
But the Confederate Army actually got to and obtained the heights of Cemetery Hill, not once, but twice during that course of that day. Once under a Georgia division commander by the name of Wright. He was standing on the ridge, looking down at the Union Army headquarters where Meade was. He held his division briefly held the crest of the ridge, but they were unsupported, so they had to retreat. And then later on in the evening, Jubal Early and his men, also a Confederate general named Hayes, were standing on top of Cemetery Hill, and they had captured all the Union artillery, but they were unsupported and they had to withdraw. If either one of those two units had been supported, then the war would have had taken a much different turn. Anyway, so what Chamberlain did was important, but it wasn't the only key to the battle.
No,
all right, I'll make these other ones short. Buford, Buford was cast. The guy that plays him is a guy named Sam Elliott, And Sam Elliott's just a
And
very famous.
just to clarify for the students that you're talking about the movie.
Then the movie, yeah, then the movie, he's cast by Sam Elliott plays him, and Sam Elliott plays is a perfect person to be in that role. When you see Sam Elliott portray Buford, you really get a good sense of what Buford was like. Buford was very serious man. He had been an Indian fighter. He had been a cavalryman his entire career in the Army. He's a one-star general. He's a brigadier general. He was also reckless in battle, without any thought. He had no fear. The man had no fear and no thought at all to his own personal safety, which is one of the reasons why he dies later on in the year.
Yeah,
he didn't die of wounds. He died of illness, but
yeah,
he just completely did not think about his own safety or his own situation. And then Longstreet is very well cast in the movie too, if you've seen the movie.
yep.
And in the book, he's portrayed very, very accurately as well. Longstreet was a tall, burly man. He was a mountain of a man. And he had a tremendous beard, and he had piercing blue eyes. He had been very gregarious and fun-loving until he had a tragedy in his life where I believe 2 of his young children died of typhoid, I believe.
Wow.
After the death of his children this was in 1861, 1862, he wasn't, of course, home to say goodbye to his children. He became extremely distant. He kind of had that 10,000-mile stare.
Yeah.
And just real melancholy, and his personality was altered considerably. He was also surly. He was a little bit of I'm trying to be kind about it. He was sulky. He was sulky. When he didn't get his way, he was sulky. And at Gettysburg, he was sulky, and this is covered in the book and also in the movie. And that's true. He was sulky. He didn't want to fight there at all. He wanted the Confederate Army to move around to the Union left and interpose themselves between the Union Army in Gettysburg and Washington and Baltimore to force them to fight in another place. He didn't want to carry out his orders the way that Lee ordered him to on the second day. And he most certainly didn't want to charge the center of the Union line on the third day. So everything that's written, everything that he covers in the book is accurate.
Good. Oh, that's really very helpful. And yeah, students, I don't think I've even mentioned it yet. And I believe it was 1993 when this movie came out. Yeah. So that's students, right. You're after you read the book, this is one of those times where your teachers are telling you need to watch this movie.
You do.
I mean, it is extraordinarily well done. And according to Dr. Wilsey, very, very accurate. Well, thank you, Dr. Wilsey. Let's close this one out. This has been video number 3 out of 10 total that we're doing on The Killer Angels. Here's what I want you to do, students. Before you start the next video, I want you to go to Killer Angels, and you'll notice that the days are laid out there. I want you to read the first half of Wednesday, July the 1st. So we're going to do half a day, then go to Thursday, half a day. So we'll do basically a couple of videos on each of those. I think that cuts the reading load down a little bit. And we're going to start with the obvious question in the next video. Why are we skipping Tuesday? And then a topic I know Dr. Wilsey likes to talk about, Robert E. Lee. See you then, friends.